Now, switch again. This is a question on the distinction between structuralism and post-structuralism.
Yeah.
And we make the observation that structuralism is more like Latin and post-structuralism is more like Greek, which reminded me of the distinction that Heidegger made between German philosophy and French philosophy.
Right, yeah. That's interesting. That's interesting.
So, can you talk about that?
Well, my point there was that I was trying really to suggest that they were similar too, you see, as well as different. After all, Greek and Latin belong to the same language families. But being archaic languages, we're able to sort of grasp their features a little bit more easily than features that they have in common and that they do not share. A little more easily than would be the case if we said, well, structuralism is French and post-structuralism is American. Right? What would that mean? It would be very helpful, I think, since the syntactical systems and the lexicons and so forth appear to be so similar, right? Between two. But I've always been impressed by the idea that the very notion of the post is an interesting prefix, right? I mean, first of all, it's a kind of privative prefix. You have structuralism, then you have what comes after structuralism, but the suggestion is that it's articulated as the perception of a flaw, of some inadequacy in structuralism, but you haven't yet, since you don't give a new name to this new movement, you only can define it in terms of what it's repudiating. You still don't know what the positive content of the later phenomena is. So I think we have to talk about the ways in which the one requires the other, both as cultural movements and as concepts. The one requires the other as its own negative, without being able to stipulate what the positivity is that they have, that they share. That's an abstract way of talking about any movement. And this would only apply, really, to people who name themselves this way. I mean, name yourself as a post-structuralist is not to give a positive content. I mean, you're saying, I'm not that, right? Which is the appeal, of course, of racism. I may not know what I am, but I am not that. I mean, that's the dialectic of alienated discourse, right? To be more specific about the Latin-Greek thing, I really had in mind a story that was told me by Derrida about, and this derives from the fact that his important work, not only his work, but a lot of post-structuralist work in France defines itself as trying to grasp a mode of relationship to the world, or art, what have you, text, construed text. They liken it to the Greek middle voice, which is a verb form, a grammatical form that Greek has that Latin doesn't have. And the other difference between the two languages is that it's the marvelous richness of the Greek verb that allows us to compare with the relative weakness of the Latin verb and the corresponding strength of the Latin noun and prepositional phrases and inflections and so on. That seem to bear some relationship to the difference between scholasticism, scholastic theology, and mystical theology, where mystical theology has its origins in the West, Christian mystical theology, in the Greek fathers, and in the Byzantine and the Russian mystical tradition, or Irish mysticism. So what you've got here, I think, is a way of characterizing, metaphorically really, what many people feel is this kind of mystical obscurantism of certain kinds of the postmodernist discourse, as in Derrida, the later work of Roland Barthes, And to a certain extent in Foucault, everyone complains about the obscurity of Foucault's style. And it's obvious that those three writers, while certainly valorizing, as we say nowadays, clarity of expression, also feel themselves compelled both to celebrate and actually practice a certain systematic obscurantism, reminding us always you can't say everything. Right? That discourse is fragmented, it's broken off, it's internally inconsistent, it's undecidable. That is not. That's the language of the mystic in religion. Negative theology underlying mysticism. It's not the language of scholasticism any more than structuralism resembles scholasticism. And this scholasticism envisions a hermeneutic system of analysis that answers all questions. All questions are answered. There is no need for a negative theology, positive. So I think that difference is what I was trying to get at there. It was just a joke.
But it's also the same distinction between code and poetic function.
That's right. I extend it to the notion of whether you stress code or poetic function in Jacobsonian terms in the discourse. And I think that post-structuralism, now, as represented by Derrida from Differençons, by the later Barthes, the Barthes who theorizes the punctum studium distinction in his analysis of photography, the Barthes of the pleasure of the text and of the fragment of a lover's discourse, namely this Barthes. Foucault, much earlier actually, in his work on Raymond Roussel and automatic writing, his theory of the tropes, his own study of the tropes in the sections on the 18th century in Mose and shows. This version of post-structuralism, which I wouldn't, and I think even Deleuzean, Deleuze and Guattari's theorization of the body without organs and nomad thought and lines of flight and all that sort of thing. That has that is a different modality of thinking about the questions raised by structuralism. Did I lose the train of that thought?
No.
Oh, I know. It was poetic function versus language. Yeah, one of the things I noticed about the semiotic conference here is that most of the semioticians really stress code function. I mean, they're always identifying codes, cross-coding, transcoding, decoding, overcoding. But they talk in terms of code. Very few of them talk in terms of poetic function. And yet, that was the thing that really could be called a greater contribution of Jacobson to structuralist thinking and how structures break down through overdetermination. See, overcoding is more of a poetic function because the metalinguistic function should result in more clarity, not overdetermination.
Well, related to that is this notion of structuralism, this relationship between text and cognition.
Sure.
Text and cognition.
Yeah.
And how you can strip away the meanings and manipulate meanings to see how it's constructed. And that's actually how it's coded. And then the poetic function would be.
Well, the poetic function, I mean, you recall that for Jacobson, that is a second principle of structuration that is more directed toward the provision of patterns that are less cognitively semantic than visually semanticizing, orally semanticizing, and so forth. Remember that for him, the poetic function, for example, is manifested in meter, rhyme, in formal poetry, but also all rhetorical emphases, all emphasis, repetition, things of this sort. Repetition is for the metalinguistic analysis. Repetition is either noise or reinforcement. You see, but it's not a rhetorical category. It's not. Doesn't add new meaning. Doesn't add meaning. But in poetic or rhetorical terms, repetition is adds new meaning. It's like when I answer a question with a question or with another question. I mean, That's a commentary on it. That's an answer to the question. You remember the joke. Why did Jews answer a question with another question? And why not?